Hello and welcome to the Pulpit Fiction Podcast, a lectionary podcast for preachers, seekers, and Bible geeks. This is episode 657 for January 25th, 2026, the third Sunday after Epiphany of Year A. Today we're going to discuss the Gospel reading of Matthew 4, verses 12 through 23, the calling of the fishermen. Then our second reading, Isaiah, is going to be Isaiah 9, 1 through 4. And then the epistle reading, we're going to continue in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 10 through 18. Who's the Baptist? I am Robb, McCoy, United Methodist pastor here in Rock Island, Illinois, and I'm joined as always by my good friend and co-host, not recording live, but recording, not broadcasting live, but recording on January 8th, my good friend and co-host, Eric Fistler. How are you doing, buddy?
Good, man. Good. It's, again, we're recording early. I'm away next week at a conference, and we have a conference for called the Conversations Conference for senior pastors of multi-staff churches in the United Church of Christ. So we're excited for that. But it means that I can't record because I'll be in the midst of a session, keynote and otherwise sessions. So so excited that we get to kind of record early and keep this thing going. But it's nice to kind of ease into the new year continually. I mean, I don't know how late. I mean, this is the 25th, so I don't know how long we can ease in for. I feel like it's going to be Lent, and I'll still be saying I'm easing into the new year, but
yeah, how long can you say Happy New Year before it's annoying? I think at this point it's way.
I think it's about as far as we go.
Yeah, this is definitely too long.
It's hard because we're talking about the 25th, but for those of you who are annoyed, for us it's still the 8th. So bear with us here just a little bit. We do what we can. So
yeah, you bring up a good point though. You're going to a conference, and we learned some bad news fairly recently that the Festival of Homiletics is not happening. What is always one of our favorite conferences. We didn't go every year, but we went pretty regularly over the years.
Yeah.
There's a vacuum. Wild Goose is another big one. But it's so different. We're not camping kind of guys. I mean, I've enjoyed the Wild Goose. I only went one time, I guess, and really did enjoy it. But it kind of leaves a void. I'm just curious if, I don't know if you know of any. Another big one is the Leadership Institute out in Kansas City. Adam Hamilton's church does it's a very practical sort of conference as far as church work is concerned. I'd be interested in hearing from folks. If you've got, if you're a big Festival of Homiletics fan, what's going to fill that void, that continuing education, that renewal? Because that's a big loss.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And it'd be really fascinating, I think, to hear that. There are some others out there, but I don't know if it's the same kind of bent. I mean, I've heard things about like the Orange Conference. I've known other folks. I think that has more of an evangelical bent to it. And then there are some others. But yeah, what are the events, listeners, that you really enjoy going to? I think that would be really fascinating to hear. I couldn't believe, I was very surprised to see that Festival of Homiletics wasn't happening this year. And at first I thought it was canceled forever. It hasn't said that. But it's definitely not happening this year. So that's alarming to say the least, because that was a big one. And it's also a balance, and I know it's a balance a lot of people in the church are having, which is, did the digital offering for Festival of Homiletics help it or hurt it? And that I don't know. It'd be interesting to know. But I know a lot of churches, there's a debate about that. If you have an online thing, does that mean people are not going to come back in person? That hasn't been the case for some folks, but for others. So I think there's a lot to happen. But end all be all of this. Let us know, what are the conferences you go to? What are the things that you get, and why do you like to go to those? Send that all to show@pulpitfiction.us, or you can send us a note on Facebook. Just find us at Pulpit Fiction on Facebook. So you can leave a note there, or you can comment on any of our videos on YouTube as well if you want to comment there. But we'd love to hear from you and hear what your thoughts are. And Rob, we're going to be, this week is the calling of the fishermen, but shortly after that, we're going to dip our toe into the Sermon on the Mount. And I know you had kind of brought up a really good resource if folks are looking at maybe starting the Sermon on the Mount early or doing something, maybe a Bible study or something with it.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's what in the Epiphany season, I am just in the Sermon on the Mount. I divided up 5 through 7 and divided it up from last week until Transfiguration Sunday, and that's what we're going to be doing. And in so doing, I found this resource, the Bible Project, which we've talked about before. The Bible Project is no new resource, no big surprise. But what is, I don't know if it's new, but what I just found, it's new to me, is they have a 10-part series just on the Sermon on the Mount, and it is fantastic. Like most of their work, it's really good. There's 10, they're all about 5 to 7 minute videos. It's not just the drawing, which you think you associate. I associate the sort of drawing the storyboard animation.
Hmm.
It's not like full cartoon animation, but it's definitely figures. It's kind of in between. It's like animated pictures with figures and scenery, and they sort of almost like paper cutouts moving around.
Hmm.
But it's really well done, just deep theologically, deep. They all the good scholarship that you're used to at the Bible Project. They talk about the kingdom of the sky, right, and explain that instead of the kingdom of heaven, which is just one of those little things that is really interesting. I think. Um, I don't know, really well done. So we shared a link in the show notes, and I'll share it again. But basically, if you just Google the Bible Project Sermon on the Mount, you'll be able to find it. There is a link, but it's got a couple slashes and stuff. So, it's 10 parts. I did it. I actually used it with a youth retreat. I had kids out for about a 24-hour youth
Oh
retreat.
yeah.
And over the course of the day, we watched, I didn't go all 10, but we watched about 7 or 8 of them and then would talk about them and then kind of chop them up. So we had these like 15 to 20 minute learning sessions a bunch of times in between games and all the other fun youth group stuff. Had tremendously positive feedback from the youth that they learned. Like one of them said, I actually liked the Bible parts this time, Mom. So it was really good. It was anyway, I can't say enough about it. Definitely a resource worth checking out. And no, they are not sponsors. But we
Not yet.
are, they should be. But anyway, yeah, great stuff.
Sounds good. Well, let's jump into our good news for this week with Matthew 4.
Very few comparatively know what is the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Good news, everyone.
All right, a little bit of a longer passage this week. It's Matthew 4, verses 12 through 23. This is the Common English Bible. Now, when Jesus had heard that John was arrested, he went to Galilee. He left Nazareth and settled in Capernaum, which lies along the sea in the area of Zebulun and Naphtali. This was to fulfill what Isaiah the prophet said. Land of Zebulun and Naphtali, across the sea, across the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people who have lived in the dark have seen a great light, and a light has come upon those who lived in a region and in the shadow of death. From that time, Jesus began to announce, "Change your hearts and lives. Here comes the kingdom of heaven." As Jesus walked alongside the Galilee Sea, he saw 2 brothers, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew, throwing fishing nets into the sea because they were fishermen. "Come, follow me," he said, "and I'll show you how to fish for people." Right away they left their nets and followed him. Continuing on, he saw another set of brothers, James the son of Zebedee and his brother John. They were in a boat with Zebedee, their father, repairing the nets. Jesus called them, and immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. Jesus traveled throughout Galilee, teaching in their synagogues. He announced the good news of the kingdom and healed every disease and sickness among the people.
All right. So a lot happens here in a very short time, somewhat repetitive from last week, right? When we had the calling of the brothers and the 2 sets of brothers in the Gospel of John. And now here we have the calling of 2 sets of brothers, right? But slightly different, very different story. So that's a little bit of just a shell shock right off the bat, is that we're retelling the same story. A lot of times the lectionary will, when John butts in, to sort of let John take over the telling of the story. But here Matthew does get to have his calling piece, which is weird, honestly, because it is so different. So you gotta, there's a lot you can do in the Bible study about the different Gospels. You can debate over how much you do this in the sermon moment, but it is a good chance to lift up, like, the Gospels are different. And I say this because I remember going to church. No, I didn't go to church every Sunday. I wasn't like but I was pretty regular. And I just remember going to seminary and learning this stuff and being really mad. Like, why didn't anybody tell me this? And maybe people had and I just wasn't listening. But I think it's good to have some of this kind of biblical criticism from the pulpit that's not like deep, deconstruction of authorship and stuff like that, but some of this just acknowledging that the gospels are different. And a week like this, when you're basically hearing the same story twice, um, it's hard to avoid.
Yeah, and I think it's a helpful thing to just point out because otherwise at times people can it almost seems like you're hiding it or we're embarrassed by it. It is what
Right.
it is. It's two different stories and they are remarkably different stories, right? I mean, last week again, let's think about that. We had the two disciples of John, Andrew and one who was unnamed. Then you had Simon, the brother of Andrew. Then you had Philip, who was from the same town of Bethsaida. And then you had Nathanael, who was a friend of Philip. And let's remember, none of them were fishermen, right?
Mhm.
Unlike the synoptics, none of them were fishermen. And you had that phrase, come and see. This is very different, where instead you've got John and James, the son of Zebedee. You've got Andrew and Simon. And even with Simon, Rob, it's also tricky because it comes right out and says Simon, who is called Peter, which is different from this Simon who is renamed Peter. Now, later, it's interesting, in Matthew 16, we'll get the piece that says, and I say to you, Jesus will say after Simon Peter has said, you are the Christ. Jesus says, and I say to you, you are Peter, and on this rock I'll build my church. But the idea that Jesus renames Peter is not in this gospel either. So it's different from John, where we had just last week, by the way, you will now be called Cephas, and your name is Peter, where you have Jesus renaming Peter. Whereas here, that's just his name. His name is Simon Peter. So they disagree. I think just acknowledging that. And one thing that I know some churches do that may be a helpful piece, if it doesn't fit with the sermon, then do an intro before you read the scripture. Say, listen, we're going to hear a different story about the calling of the disciples. And it's going to be different than what we heard last week. And one of the beauties of scripture is that we don't just have one story, but even our scripture itself is a community and conversation telling different stories. There were different stories about how the disciples were called. And so let's look at how the author of Matthew saw this and what that has to say to us, because it can tell us something different. And you could do a whole thing too about the fact that I think it's one of the beauties of scripture is because we have four gospels and they tell things differently. It gives us a more rounded, a more nuanced view of who Jesus is than if we just had one monolithic story. And so there's helpful ways to bring that out. But as you said, Rob, just reading it and not mentioning it at all can almost feel like we're trying to hide it or not say something about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So one great little teaching tool that you can use, and I talked about last week and before, there's The Chosen, which I think is a really well done show. Season 1, episode 4 has a great depiction of this. It's a great scene of no, you know what? I wish we could cut this out because it's the miraculous catch. We don't have that here, right? And that's what's fascinating. In Luke, we have the miraculous catch, and then Jesus calls the disciples, and they start to follow him. And the question of like, why would they follow this guy, is somewhat answered by Luke. It's not in Matthew. It's Matthew's much more mysterious. It's just a sort of, you know what? And I feel like in Mark, Jesus already healed Simon's mother-in-law before he calls him. So like in Mark and Luke, there's like a reason, here it's so mysterious. It's just Jesus' magnetism, right? I mean, it's his divine power. I don't know, his divine riz. Don't say that. You'll get, unless you want teenagers to hurt their eye rolling muscles. It just comes out of nowhere. And I think that's worth discussing. Like, why did it's one of those chances to put people in, fill in the blank. Why did they follow him? It could be a lot of things. It's not said why. Was there something about Jesus that just in this moment they were willing to leave their nets and follow, because Matthew's story is so different than, it's very similar to Mark and Luke, but in that sense, it's so different. It is just out of nowhere, we're going to follow because Jesus asked.
Yeah.
It's an interesting story choice.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting piece where we have this kind of, and it's not even an asking, it's command, right? Come, it's that imperative. Come, follow me. I'll show you how to shift for people. But it's the power of this consistent piece of in the Gospels. Change your hearts and lives. Repent, for the kingdom of God is near. Right? We hear that same. That's how Jesus begins preaching in the Gospel of Mark. We've heard that from John the Baptist, this repent, for the kingdom, here comes the kingdom of heaven, or the kingdom of heaven is near. And so there's something compelling about this idea of change your hearts and lives, turn back to God who has always turned to you, something about the kingdom of heaven that's coming. And then again, you have this come and follow me, which is different from last week's come and see, right? Come and see is more of an invitational. This is more commanding, right? This idea of how to, what are we going to do? How to fish for people. But I think part of this passage too, we've got to look before we jump into what feels like the meat, I feel like we skip some interesting pieces at the beginning. The very first thing that's most interesting is, especially coming after last week, if folks are not thinking, which a lot of folks in the pews probably aren't, like, wait, we were in John's gospel last week. But this is right at the beginning. And this passage starts with, now when Jesus heard that John was arrested, he went to Galilee. Whoa, what? It's also an interesting piece too, which is the question of, where was Jesus before this? Right? Jesus wasn't in Galilee. Jesus presumably was down with John, closer to, most likely around Jericho, in that area. Farther south is where a lot of scholars think that that's where John was doing his baptizing, east of Jerusalem. And it's only after John is arrested that he goes to Galilee. And then the question there is, why? That seems to be more of an impetus than anything else. More than even, we have before this, you have the temptation. Jesus is out there, but it doesn't say, now after Jesus was tempted, he went to Galilee. It's very specific. It's after John was arrested. So that piece of that trauma, that fear, that impetus, that moves us, it reminds me when we were talking with Leah Gunning Francis, or their book, Ferguson and Faith, and talked about how many, I'm constantly amazed at how many prophetic justice leaders never set out to do that. So I think of like Tracy Blackman, who was so, Reverend Tracy Blackman, so instrumental, so pivotal in the midst of Ferguson and the murder of Michael Brown. And she didn't sign up. She wasn't right there. Leah Gunning Francis talks about the fact that I think she was like at home in bed when she got the call and didn't really want to go, and then ended up being right there on kind of the front lines of that civil disobedience. You see more and more people that you hear those stories where they didn't intend to be on the front line of justice, but those things, but something happened. There was an impetus. There was something that moved and changed their view. And so in the same way too, I think, how much of an impetus was John being arrested, where that this agrees. And by the way, the synoptics agree on this. John doesn't necessarily, but the synoptics agree on this. And then later, of course, we'll see such a dramatic change when John is killed. And we've talked about that. But the arrest of John is really, even more than the temptation, is the impetus for Jesus's ministry to begin.
Yeah, it's a catalyst moment. It really is. And
that's where
you think about that when, quick side note, that's not Rosa Parks, right? That's often how that story is framed. Rosa Parks planned that stuff.
Right.
She knew what she was doing and was very intentional about that. That wasn't this. But there's lots of times when, Martin Luther King getting arrested, the whole point of being arrested was to sort of stir things up. Now, I'm not saying John was arrested on purpose to get Jesus going. But that's, if you told the story, if you dramatize the story, that wouldn't be wrong, right? Like dramatizations of stories have to add some things. But this idea of John's arrest got Jesus going, because like you said, Matthew, Mark, and Luke all say it very explicitly. There is a temptation, But what starts Jesus on his ministry is the arrest of John. And think about Martin Luther King's letter from the Birmingham jail and these kinds of things. Sort of, of course, Nelson Mandela being in jail, and like how you can lead from jail. And there's something about Jesus' ministry is framed in the violence of the state, right? Taking somebody's freedom away. It is framed in servitude, or and Jesus. Then the first act of liberation happens in the shadow of John's jailing, which I think is a fascinating thing. Quick note, it's worth doing because we are going to be in Matthew for a little while. We did interview Warren Carter a while back about his book. Christ or Jesus and Empire or Matthew. I don't remember what it's called. Great book, great scholar on the Gospel of Matthew. It's an interview worth just listening to as we head into this season of Matthew. It's definitely worth checking out.
He has a bunch, by the way, he has a bunch of books on Matthew. We just talked to him about Matthew. It was part of when we had Pulpit Fiction Academy. But he has Matthew in the margins, Matthew and Empire, the Roman Empire, the New Testament. So there's a lot
Matthew
of
in the
great
margins,
stuff.
I think, is what I was thinking about.
Yeah.
It's the one that I've got that's fantastic. And I'm also reminded of Ched Meyer's work with this phrase, fishers of men.
Yeah.
Right. Although Ched Meyer's book is about Mark, it's a direct quote. This idea of Jesus calling the disciples to be fishers of men, and what that means. And there's some really fascinating, like the fishermen in the prophets were fishing for the exploiters, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the fishers were there's catching the unjust kings with a fish hook. It's a fascinating piece about what it means that fishers of men is a reminder of it's advocating for justice, right? It's being this sort of in Jeremiah, in Ezekiel, in Amos. The symbolism is finding finding those sources of injustice, and God will fish them out. And I think that's a very interesting statement, right? We often consider this as a very evangelical. Oh, you're going to be fishers of men. You're going to go catch men and like lead them to Christ. But what Ched Myers is saying, no, this is much more prophetic, saying you're going to go and advocate for justice.
Yeah, and the Binding the Straw Man, he writes, quote, "There is perhaps no expression more traditionally misunderstood than Jesus' invitation to these workers to become fishers of men. This metaphor, despite, as you mentioned, Rob, the grand tradition of missionary interpretation, does not refer to the saving of souls, as if Jesus were conferring upon these men instant evangelist status. Rather, this image is carefully chosen from Jeremiah 16:16, where it is used as a symbol of Yahweh's censure of Israel. Elsewhere, the hooking of fish is a euphemism upon judgment against the rich, Amos 4:2, and the powerful, Ezekiel 29:4. Taking this mandate for his own, Jesus is inviting common folk to join him in his struggle to overturn the existing order of power and privilege." The interesting piece on that, too, is the other aspect that we miss, which is we're going to get into when we get into the Isaiah passage. But the other part that we miss is this whole business about Zebulun and Naphtali. Now, let's be clear. Matthew is a proof texter, the proof texter. He loves to proof text like crazy. But this is interesting because this area of Zebulun and Naphtali have an interesting history in the in Israel and also just in the geopolitical world. So the idea of it being known as Galilee of the Gentiles goes all the way back to the book of Joshua and during the conquest narratives, when these tribes belonged to, the areas of Nazareth, which belonged to Zebulun, and the area of northwest of the Sea of Galilee, which belonged to the tribe of Naphtali, this kind of general area. But the thing that we have to know, and again, we'll talk about this in the Isaiah passage, is that these were the areas that when Assyria dominated Israel, invaded Israel in 732, he captured these areas, including specifically the land of Naphtali. We can see that in 2 Kings 15. And so the entire region became an Assyrian province. Even more than that, later, right now, this is very much a center of Roman activity. There was a massive Roman road that also went through that same reason. So the concept of a powerful, occupying, oppressive nation in this area, which is why it's known as Galilee of the Nations or Galilee of the Gentiles, is when we hear in the land of Zebulun and Naphtali, most of us hear that and just, okay, it's Matthew proof texting again. But instead, Matthew is setting the stage and saying, listen, Jesus is moving from wherever Jesus was before, from the south or from Nazareth or wherever. Jesus is moving specifically to the center of this oppressive power. And it's in the midst of this center of oppressive power, not just now, but historically, going back hundreds of years, that this has been a center of oppressive power. It's there that Jesus is going to call, and going back to what you were saying, Rob, these fishers of men who are called not just to preach the good news, but specifically called to preach what? A new kingdom. Right? Which the very aspect of proclaiming that the kingdom of heaven is new is a seditious activity to say that there is something that is over and above and beyond the powers of this world. So it really is quite a political aspect that's happening here.
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason why Nathanael said, well, could anything good come from Galilee, right? Or from Nazareth, right? I mean, it's from this area that it was thought of as not a great place for Jews, especially. Like, it wasn't an easy place to live. And the Galilean ministry then of Jesus going around in Galilee, finding his first followers, and I would argue, to a certain extent, gathering his army that he feeds eventually with 5,000, he feeds 5,000 men. That's a legion, right? That is, that's what the Galilean ministry is all about. But it's an army that doesn't march to Jerusalem for conquest. It's an army that, is presenting the Basileia Uranos, right? The king, the empire of the sky.
Right.
And I think that's, go ahead.
Yeah, and Warren Carter picks up exactly on that, Rob. Warren Carter writes, he also has a commentary on Working Preacher, where he talks about exactly what you're saying in terms of the calling itself, where it says, he writes, quote, Jesus then calls two sets of brothers to be his followers. They are fishermen embedded in the imperial economy. Rome asserted control over the land and sea, their production, and the transportation and marketing of their yields with contracts and with taxes. Jesus disrupts these men's lives, calls them to a different loyalty, a different way of life, creates a new community, gives them a new mission, this fishing for people, and his summons exhibits God's empire at work. This light shining in the darkness of Roman-ruled Galilee. So again, even when calling them out, I think often, we think of this pastoral, beautiful, look, Rob, they're just out casting nets. We have to remember that at the end of the day, they're working for Rome. They're working at Rome's behest. And so this is a powerful thing that they're not just leaving their family and their inheritance and their security and all of those other things, but again, they're also no longer creating what Rome needs, the food and things that Rome needs, and the taxes, and they are being called out of the system of oppression into something new, which is also interesting, as you said, Rob. The kingdom of the sky. It's a fascinating thing as Rome has control over the land and the sea, and Jesus is calling them to the kingdom of, the Basileo in kingdom of heaven, Basileo to Uranos, right? The kingdom of heavens, the kingdom of the skies.
Yeah. And what else did they leave? Their father.
Yeah.
Right. And that's huge too.
Right.
They're leaving also that tradition, that identity, that security, right? I mean, and Matthew doesn't explicitly say it. I feel like in other gospels it's more explicit that it's their boats. This one, it just says they left the boat, but there's this sort of, they're leaving their security, their identity also. And that's an easy thing to gloss over, but that's an incredibly powerful thing too. And again, it leads you to this understanding of why were they so quick to leave?
Yeah.
Maybe because they realized they were already under such oppression. They were already under such a system that was so degrading that it wasn't that hard to leave.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm trying to think of an a separate analogy, but it's like, okay, the thing that popped in my head, there's an old episode of The Office when Michael Scott's making the Michael Scott Paper Company, and he calls Vikram to join him.
Oh yeah.
And Vikram was he worked at a calling
the telemarketing
and he's like
vitamin agency. Yeah.
And he goes, if you're putting your telemarketing career at risk, you're not really putting much at risk. Right? Maybe that's part of it. Like if you're putting your life under Roman oppression at risk, what kind of a life is that?
Right.
And so that could be why they were so easy to leave as well, because they were wanting something to believe in, because it was already such a bad situation.
But at the same time, too, it's also you're right, Rob. But
it's speculation.
In our own context, imagine how we every day participate in corrupt, broken, empirical systems. But our empire isn't Rome and Assyria. It's Amazon. It's
9
oil,
to 5 jobs,
it's fossil
right?
fuels. It's there are all of these other things that we know are broken, and yet they're so hard to break. They're so hard to leave. How does it? What would it be like to be called out of shopping at Amazon? What would it take it to be called out of shopping at Walmart? What would it take it to be called out of not buying unjust coffee, unjust chocolate, unjust, all of these things these broken systems that we know are broken, we know are corrupt, and yet somehow we still, and I put myself in this, we continue to participate that. Animals, right? I mean, who doesn't go to a fast food place, get a burger, and you don't know that the meat that you're eating is harvested in the most inhumane, horrific way possible? I mean, it's just in a way that none of us would go to that food factory, that meat factory, and do it. And yet we still participate in these systems, right? So I think that there's an acknowledgement of saying, like, yes, it's easy to leave, to live for something better, but also let's understand that there are the systems that we all hate and love to hate, but we continue to give them our money, our time, and energy.
Yeah, they feel impossible to leave. In fact, protests are, you mentioned last week the No Kings protests. I feel like there's been protests of just like, don't go to Amazon for a day, right? And like how hard that can be, and it's not hard for everybody, but like this stuff pops up. I thought about when Spotify Wrapped became popular and everyone was sharing their Spotify Wraps. And then a couple of, Heather Lynn and some other great independent musicians that I know shared, like, let me tell you about Spotify. Let's put a wrap to Spotify and like the unjust ways that they exploit artists. And I was talking to an artist about, you have to have 1,000 plays for them to get like anything. They don't give anything to anybody until somebody gets 1,000 plays, right? And even then they start at 1,001. Right. And none of the first 1,000 count. And then it resets every year. Right. I mean, and this is just one small way and yet, what am I listening to? I've been listening to Spotify all day.
Yeah.
So, I mean, like you said, you're locked into, we're so, and it's an excuse to say we're locked in because I could find other ways. I could. And maybe I should. Right. But when you talk about the empire of God is at hand, it's near. It is near if we have the courage to actually follow it.
Yeah. It's harder than it sounds.
Yeah.
Well, friends, there's more in the show notes. Go check all of that at pulpitfiction.com. Again, that's pulpitfiction.com, where you can find our other commentary as well as links to all of these shows and more.
Previously on the Bible.
Ruth, I smell Heaven's Bakery cooking up something good for you, sister.
Okay, Rob, I feel like this is a little bit cheap because I feel like the lectionary is just leaning in a little bit to some of the proof texting stuff that we had talked about. But we also said that there are some political things where this works. But either way, we get just a little dip of our toe here in Isaiah 9, 1 through 4, Common English Bible. Nonetheless, those who are in distress won't be exhausted. At an earlier time, God cursed the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, but later he glorified it in the way of the sea, on the far side of the Jordan, and the Galilee of the nations. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. Those living in a pitch dark land, light has dawned. You have made the nation great. You have increased its joy. They rejoiced before you as with joy at the harvest, as those who divided plunder rejoice. As on the day of Midian, you shattered the yoke that burdened them, the staff on their shoulders, and the rod of their oppressor. I feel like I just
All
read
right,
this.
so I was going to say, I had to take a double take when I saw that. I'm like, oh, did I not copy and paste it right? Like, didn't we just do this? Yeah. I mean, especially for us, as we're recording on January 8th, it's even more compressed. This was a Christmas Eve text. And granted, most people probably on Christmas Eve were doing Luke 2, most likely, I would think. But if you read this, just a few short weeks ago, it is a good way to tie it back in. And yes, it is very proof texty. Matthew mentioned Zebulun and Naphtali, so let's read Isaiah talking about Zebulun and Naphtali. And we've talked about some of that context already, but it is, within the lecture, a good chance to say, remember that stuff we talked about at Christmas Eve? Here it is.
Yeah.
Right? Like, the baby was born. Here's what he's doing. And it's not just about Jesus, but it is a good connection to this is making you're making the nation great. You're increasing its joy by shattering the yoke that burdens them, by crushing oppressors, by breaking the staff of oppression and exploitation. And so it's when you see that verse 3, you made the nation great, that is such a politically charged phrase nowadays. And so you can lean into that as much or as little, proceed with caution. But the understanding that the great nation is one that's liberated, one that doesn't have exploitation, that isn't oppressing. And that, I think, is powerful. This still, though, feels so abrupt. It feels like such a short passage. Because there's so much more context to it.
And let's be honest, the editing, passage goes through verse 7. The fact that it's edited down means that even if Matthew is not doing his usual proof texting, the RCL definitely is in this and just using this as a supportive text. And so if we were to continue, and some of you may say, I don't remember reading this. If we were to continue the next 2 verses, every warrior's boot is used in battle, and every garment will be rolled in blood and will be destined for burning and will be fuel for the fire. And here we go, Rob. For unto us a child is born, or to us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulder, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace, and of his greatness, of his kingdom, of his government, and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing it and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this, right? So if you're preaching this, preach the whole passage. Preach 1 through 7. Don't just preach this tiny little snippet and bite. But to go back to what we were saying before, there's an interesting piece here, which is there's some debate. Is this pre-exilic? Is it post-exilic? Now, for those of you who are shouting, it's first Isaiah, it's pre-exilic. Pre-exilic, yes, but we know that there are multiple examples where post-exilic Isaiah inserts itself into first Isaiah. So either way, it doesn't really matter, because whether we're talking pre-exilic and we're talking about the Assyrian destruction of Zebulun and Naphtali in 722, remember, so Zebulun and Naphtali are 2 of the 10 northern tribes. You can see a map for it by going to pulpitfiction.com. If you go to this podcast this day for the Epiphany 3a, you'll see the map that has it. So Zebulun and Naphtali were 2 of the northernmost tribes. They were 2 of the ones that were the first that were assimilated and eradicated by the Assyrians between 733 and 730. 722 is when all of the northern tribes are eradicated. So these are some of the first to go. it could be referring to that. It could be talking post-exilic to the Syrio-Ephraimite coalition as well. And the king that it could be talking about is either, whether it's pre-exilic Hezekiah or post-exilic Josiah. Either way, it doesn't matter. We're talking that this is a message to a people who are oppressed and occupied. And it's saying that in the midst of this oppression and occupation, that the rod of the oppressor will be broken, that those who are in darkness will not be left there, but a new king will lead them out. Is there any surprise, Rob, that the early Christians called back to this passage? Yeah. I mean, whether it's Assyria, Syrio-Ephraimite, Rome, or the military-industrial complex and the new MAGA state that wants to take over the Western Hemisphere, there's a variety of different ways in which there are those who are oppressed and occupied people.
And that's why 5 through 7 is so important, because every boot of the thundering warriors will be burned in the fire.
Yeah.
Right. The boots of the soldiers will be silenced. It's not to say that it's, the weapons of war, the things that make for war will be silenced by the new empire. Uh-huh. Right. The new king. The new kingdom is one of peace, of wonderful counseling and peace, not death and destruction and violence and bloodshed. So yeah, it's worth at least reading to verse 7, if not more. But I mean, that's this is the roots of a little bit of this is too, some of the historical context of the roots of the split between the Jews and the Samaritans. Right, that eventually it's the northern kingdom that sort of evolves into, that maybe assimilated too much or changed some of their ways, that evolved into the Samaritans that were so, such a much more of a theme in Luke than Matthew. But still, there's a lot of historical baggage in this moment, in this passage that is, it's another reminder that these histories are cyclical, right? And if you don't learn the history, we're going to repeat it, right? Because you just named all these other places where this could fit, or like last week when we were talking about the suffering servant, it's not named, it's ambiguous, so you could think of it as being lots of different people over history. I mean, and here we are again, with another situation, doing it all over again, which it can be both frustrating, but also very hopeful, knowing that we've been through it before and we will overcome again.
Yeah, I think there's also something too here where, we have this, there's some great quotes, by the way, in the show notes that you can find at pulpitfiction.com from Robb. One of his quotes I think is interesting is that he writes, he says, the historical context reminds us that God, even in the midst of God's wrath, is still a God of mercy, whose proper and ultimate aims are life and joy, not death and destruction. Right. And I think that that's a powerful piece, that we have this promise for light in the midst of darkness. And it's a powerful piece in this Epiphany season, because we're going to end this Epiphany season, the last Sunday before the Transfiguration Sunday, on the 5th Sunday of Epiphany, is going to end with the passage that says, you are the light of the world. Do not hide your lamp under a bushel. So the question here, I think, too, is twofold, which is not only that this is a message of enduring hope, that trouble don't last always, to quote the old spiritual, but also Jesus is going to take this same message and bring it as an invitation to you to say, you are the light of the world. So just as Christ is the light in the midst of the darkness, you are the light in the midst of the darkness. And so how are you going to be the Hezekiah, the Josiah, the Jesus, in this moment? It may seem, and it is, dark. It is. I mean, to look at what's happening in this world and not see that is to be ignorant. This is a time of terror and fear and darkness in too many places in the world. The question is not just let's sit back and wait for God to fix it, but the question is, how do we embrace these messages that, again, unfortunately come in the later half of this passage, but justice, righteousness, right? All these things, right? The kingdom of peace, justice, and righteousness, establishing that where, warriors' boots and garments of blood are put away, where we are done with the the violence and instead are working for caring for all people.
Yeah. Or as we might hear next week, blessed are the peacemakers.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Absolutely. There's so much more in the show notes. Unfortunately, or fortunately, maybe, I guess it could be either. We are going to move on to our wafer this week. And so let's get to it.
Now that's a tasty wafer.
Well, 1 Corinthians this week we're picking up right where we left off last week, and we'll pick up from verse 19 next week. It's 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 10 through 18. Now I encourage you, brothers and sisters, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, agree with each other, and don't be divided into rival groups. Instead, be restored with the same mind and the same purpose. My brothers and sisters, Chloe's people gave me some information about you, that you're fighting with each other. What I mean is this, that each one of you says, I belong to Paul, I belong to Apollos, I belong to Cephas, I belong to Christ. Has Christ been divided? Was Paul crucified for you, or were you baptized in Paul's name? Thank God that I didn't baptize any of you except for Crispus and Gaius, so that nobody can say that you were baptized in my name. Oh, I baptized the house of Stephanas too. Otherwise, I don't know if I baptized anyone else. Christ didn't send me to baptize, but to preach the good news. And Christ didn't send me to preach the good news with clever words so that Christ's cross won't be emptied of its meaning. The message of the cross is foolishness to those who are being destroyed, but it is the power of God for those of us who are being saved.
There's so many great things about this passage, Rob.
I love it.
I mean, the petty piece of this is I love Paul's constant stream of thought. So just a quick historical thing. Most likely, most of Paul's letters were dictated, and then a scribe would have actually inscribed them in. And you can definitely see that here where, I mean, it's just so funny that it's left in. And, thank God I didn't baptize any of you except Crispus and Gaius. So that none of you can be baptized in I did baptize the house of Stephanas too. You know what? I don't know who I baptized. I mean, it's just hilarious in that. And so
I don't know if I baptized anyone else. That's so great. Didn't he have a pastor's record?
Right?
His little book. Didn't he get his little book when he graduated seminary to write down? Oh my God.
Right. To write down every baptism so he could look back at. I mean, it's just funny. But also, right before we started recording, I was at a faith leaders meeting, and I was sitting next to a representative from our local mosque. And all the other vast majority of us are Christian, and so there's a rabbi there and a bunch of Christian ministers. And he turns to me and he goes, "What's the difference between all the different churches?" And I was like, "Oh dear!" And I was like, "You mean like?" And he's like, "Yeah, between like Presbyterian and yours and the Methodists and." And I was like, "Oh gosh!" So we did a really quick church history thing, but it was interesting. And as we were talking about all the different sects and groups and things like that, and then we were talking about Islam that also has its own sects, as every major religion does. So it's the thing that I appreciate about this passage so much, and I think about this so much, is the ways, Rob, that we go out of our way as humans to divide ourselves into tribes. I belong to Paul. I belong to Apollo. I belong to Cephas. I belong to Christ, right? All of these different things. And there's times I thought about this last Sunday. It's the beginning of January, and nobody, Rob, expected the Bears to be in the playoffs, the Chicago Bears. And fewer people expected that the first playoff game that we're going to play in 8 years is going to be against our hated rivals, the Green Bay Packers. And so occasionally, tongue in cheek, I will throw things out. So I was preaching on Epiphany, and I was talking about how the Magi are a bunch of weirdos. And I said, can you imagine weirdos like, Packers fans? And there are times that I will throw the Packers under the bus. So even I follow into this, but we love to divide ourselves up. Like Rob, what's better, New York style pizza or Chicago style pizza? What sports team do you like? What should you hear? Rob, do you sing Christmas hymns during Advent, or do you wait until after? I mean, we just love to find these things. It's so and so this one question: has Christ been divided? Right? I mean, it's this beautiful thing of listen. The point is to be of the same mind and the same purpose. Don't be divided into rival groups. It's a beautiful message that unfortunately is just as poignant today as it was 2,000 years ago.
Yeah. I mean, because of course the irony is so many of our denominations exist because of baptism, because of different, I mean, so many of the differences were over baptism and who's going to be baptized and when and how much water and blah, blah, blah. I mean, how much ink and blood has been spilled over this exact thing. And I mean, it's not just this, it's deeper than that. And it's the great tragedy of this, of reading this too, that we laugh about, oh, I don't even remember who I baptized, but the great tragedy of how much we didn't listen, right? Don't be divided into rival groups. So here's the question: can we be divided and not be rival groups? I think there is a place for denominations. There is a place for differences of opinion, but that doesn't mean we have to be rivals. It doesn't mean that we have to win one over the other. And so much of Christian history has been that. And right now, our denominational differences aren't nearly as strong, I think, as our political differences. And I would say not even political so much as our value differences. But it still doesn't have to be a rivalry. Yeah. It doesn't have to be we're going to win over somebody else. We're going to battle. I'm going to have the clever, he says, Christ didn't preach the good news send me to preach the good news with clever words. Christ didn't send me to Facebook to post the most devastating memes, right? I mean, so much of our discourse is finding the clever words or finding the right meme or finding the right, I'm going to get, again, it's just feeding the outrage machine. And what it does is it does empty the cross, right? It does empty the cross of its meaning because we're so interested in winning instead of winning battles, winning rivalries instead of working for peace.
Yeah. Which
is what the cross really means, being willing to die for peace and love and nonviolence. Not, I'm going to post this picture to make people feel bad for their decisions.
Right. Yeah. I mean, what does that mean? And this idea of sacrifice, not I'm going to fight until you murder me, but instead I'm going to love you no matter what, right? I mean, it's a very different, what does that look like? The power of the cross. The power of the cross, again, was not Jesus fighting until the Romans finally subdued his rebellion, but instead a power that from the cross said, Father, forgive them for they know not what they do.
Yeah. It's foolish.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. I mean, if you're in it to win, the cross is foolish.
Yeah.
And so many people are in it to win, to own the libs or to whatever it is. I mean, and I fall into it. I mean, there's some people that I follow that, that it feels really good to be outraged or to be, to see, somebody, I don't know, have these sort of one-upmanship moments, but is that really accomplishing anything? Is that really working?
Is it building the kingdom? Is it actually building
the
kingdom, or is it playing it? And it's a good question for us to ask. It's, Rob, there was a big thing in the late 90s when mega churches were exploding, and there was such a at least rhetorically violent backlash, and just the mainline churches wanted nothing to do with any of these large evangelical churches that were coming up. Now, we had vast differences, and I don't mean to diminish the vast differences. LGBTQ inclusion of women, there were a variety of things. However, also, a lot of those churches, not all of them, but there were a lot of those churches that were doing a lot of things to feed the hungry, welcome the stranger, give the thirsty something to eat, visit those who were in prison, and do some extraordinary work. And all of that good news and good ministry that was happening was largely ignored by many of the mainline churches under the auspices of, quote, that's not real church, end quote. And so it's been interesting now to find ways to where we can work together and say, what are things we can do to help build the kingdom? Again, the question is, what are we doing to help build up the kingdom? To just simply say you're doing something differently than I, and so therefore I want nothing to do with you, which is not always the case. Again, I acknowledge that there's some actual very deep theological differences there, but I think often somebody's just different. They're doing it different. They're saying it different. And so because it's not what we do, it's somehow wrong. It's somehow misguided. And so again, the question that we can ask as a church, which is, is this building up the kingdom? It reminds me of when they brought Paul to trial in, as we hear in the book of Acts, in Jerusalem. And the leader there said, they're like, what do you think we should do? Should we persecute him? And later there says, listen, if this thing is of God, it will continue. And if it does not of God, it will die out. But our job is not to enter into this and cause these issues. So the question is too, is, it's either this week or it was last week, was the week of Christian unity. I think that there's an opportunity to really talk about that. What does it mean to be in Christian unity? What does it mean to be in communion with the Catholic Church, with the Evangelical Church, with the other churches in your town? What does that look like? What does that mean? What are the ways in which we engage? Do you engage with those? And what is the way in which, if we are talking and we imagine a time where all might be one, as Jesus prayed, are we actually doing anything to build that up?
Yeah. Reminds me of the quote, and I've seen it attributed to John Wesley. I don't think he necessarily came up with it, but there's a quote that I loved: in essentials, unity; in non-essentials, liberty; in all things, charity. Right? And there's some things that are essential that we need to, demand unity to a certain extent. There's some things that aren't not essential, but we can have liberty and discussion and debate. But in all things, we do it with charity, with mercy, with love, kindness. And I think that's a good way of, I think Paul would endorse that from this passage.
Well, beloved, thank you so much for joining us for this episode of the Pulpit Fiction Podcast. We would love to hear from you. Our home and webpage is pulpitfiction.com. You can find us on Instagram and Pulpit Fiction. You can find us, Instagram and Facebook at Pulpit Fiction. You can find us on X at Pulpit F Podcast. You can always email us, and we hope that you will. Email us the conferences that you like to go to. What are the things that you're looking forward to as we mourn the loss of Festival Homiletics this year? What are the conferences that you're going to instead, the different things that you're participating in? You can send that or other thoughts and comments or corrections to show@pulpitfiction.us. You can support this show and help us keep it going by going to pulpitfiction.com/support.
If you watch a show live, most Wednesdays at 1:30 Central at youtube.com/@pulpitfiction. Make sure you put that ad in there to find our page. It's at Pulpit Fiction. If you watch on YouTube, please give us a subscribe and like the videos. We want to thank Scott Fletcher for the voice bumpers, Nikolai Heidelis for the transition music, and Brian O'Dean for this great closing song. Please have a blessed week.
We hate to say it's time to go, but it happens every time, So now you're free to go about your day. We've heard the word in voice and song. We've wondered and we've laughed along. So go and preach the good news on your way. This is the Pulpit Fiction Podcast for preachers and seekers and Bible geeks. This is the Pulpit Fiction Podcast. We'll see